Welcome everybody. Here we are with our first flip lecture of the year, and today's going to be all about resource management. And so our content objective is to really understand the different perspectives and how you go about managing resources. And we're going to take a look at two guys that really kind of develop two different schools of thought on how we can do that. And so I'm going to set this up a la Cornell. I'm a believer. And so go ahead and draw your line in right there, and I would write your essential question at the top of your notes, which is, who are Gifford Pinchot and John Muir, and how are their views different? And so Gifford Pinchot, I'm going to guess most people haven't really heard of, and John Muir we probably all have heard of, or most of us. And so we're going to start with Gifford Pinchot. And so what I would do is, you can hit pause on this, which is kind of the beauty of it. And if you want to just write down the notes, I typed them up rather than having you guys guess what I think is important. And I think it's definitely more legible than me writing them out. And so you can hit pause, or you can just kind of listen and write at the same time. But we're going to go ahead and go for it, so I hope you find this interesting. So Gifford Pinchot, just a little background on him. He was alive in the 1800s. And he came from a wealthy family, and they weren't exactly bourgeois, but they were definitely like kind of high rollers, high society in the East Coast. But his family actually made their money off of logging. And so at the time, it was definitely a different time. So picture the open frontier, and a lot of homesteading still going on, and definitely probably some tragedy of the commons going on too, because people are just kind of going for it. And so it was kind of a liquidation of forests. And his father made a lot of money. And so Gifford Pinchot goes to school, goes to college. He actually went to Yale. And when he got done, the story goes that apparently his father was feeling a little guilty about how they had gone about making all their money at the expense of all this forest. And so he sent Gifford Pinchot back to Europe, to France, to study forestry. And so in the United States, they didn't really have a forestry school. And so they were logging, but it wasn't exactly, there wasn't a science to it. People weren't studying, what's the best way to do this. People were just kind of like cutting down everything. We're just lucky they didn't have chainsaws, otherwise maybe there'd be nothing left. So Gifford goes to France and learns about forestry. He comes back and he does a couple important things. The first thing he did was he started the first forestry school in the U.S. at Yale. But more importantly, he also started, or had a big hand in starting, the U.S. Forest Service, and that's they manage the national forests, and there's hundreds, and it's all managed through the Department of Agriculture, through the federal government. So the whole theme of the U.S. Forest Service is conservation. But when we hear the word conservation now, it's kind of a buzzword, and it's kind of like the word green. Conservation back then kind of meant something differently. So Gifford Pinchot's whole thing was, how do you manage resources so you can maximize your yield? How do you get the most out of the forest? And so how do you take trees but be able to come back and get more later, right? And so you want to basically max out without depleting your resources, which is what was happening before, at the time. And so he was very much like a utilitarian, and he was, kind of seeing dollar signs, and he was all about the economy. And so with the national forest, that's the whole setup. It's a multi-use public land is what it is. And so if you've been to the national forest, which I'm going to guess a lot of you have, like Lake Tahoe is a national forest. Lake Tahoe is actually in a national forest, and then there's another forest called Tahoe National Forest right next to it, which doesn't actually have the big lake. But at any rate, you probably went camping or hiking or did something kind of recreational, which is important. But you've got all these other uses like logging, and so this is the Kootenai National Forest in Montana. And if you log a forest, obviously that's going to have an impact. And so you've got to, you're going to take the trees, which is habitat. You're going to have, these days you got machines like this. And then, how do you get all those trees out of the forest? You got to build roads, maybe a whole network of roads. Maybe there's helicopters coming in. Maybe people live there, the loggers. And so it definitely, it has an impact. You can also go mine. You can do mining. So this is a uranium mine in South Dakota, I believe, is where the Custer Forest is. And then you've got grazing happening all across the United States, all different types of public lands. And all that can definitely still lead to a tragedy of the commons, because these resources are public. No, but they're not private. You could also, they've got hydroelectric dams on national forests, and so it's just really, it runs the gamut on different uses. But the whole idea is we're going to conserve the resources, we're going to manage the resources. so they don't get wiped out. So we're going to cut it off there for Gifford Pinchot. Come back in a second because John Muir's part 2, we're going to cut it up so we can just to make it a little bit more manageable. But John Muir's super interesting too. And so hopefully we'll see you again in a second. Hello again. Here we are on part 2 of our little lecture series on resource management. And so what we're going to be looking at in this segment is the other side of the spectrum. So the first side, from the first, I guess, part 1, was all about Gifford Pinchot, who was into conservation and really saw resources as a commodity. And so how do you manage the resources and maximize your yields? John Muir, on the other hand, was on the other side of the spectrum. And so we're going to keep the Cornell thing going, and you can hit pause if you want to. But here's the line. Here's some stuff I typed out just for you guys to kind of keep track of John Muir. He had a really interesting life, and so I want to just tell you a little background story about him. And so the story goes, he was born in Scotland, and with his family they migrated to the United States, and they landed in the East Coast. Like lots of Europeans did, and so they left Scotland, and they weren't farmers in Scotland, but they came to the U.S. because they heard you could get free land to start farming, and so that's what they were going for. And so they headed west, like everybody else did, open frontier, and they got themselves to Wisconsin, and they made a common mistake that a lot of people that wanted to be farmers but didn't know how made. They saw all the trees growing in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin is really a beautiful state, lots of forest. But they saw those trees and they thought, well, if trees grow this well, corn and wheat must grow even better. And so they ended up spending, back-breaking work trying to remove all these root systems of trees to like kind of create their fields that they could farm. So little did they know they could have gone just a little bit further to like southern Minnesota or Iowa, Nebraska. Like the prairie is much more suitable for farming. And so actually there's a lot of recovering farms, abandoned farms in Wisconsin, which is another story. It makes great deer habitat, which can cause problems actually. But at any rate, so he grew up on a farm and was not, it was not in his destiny to like do what he did as like the father of preservation. He was really into inventing things. He was all over in like nature and stuff and like checking out birds. And I've read some books about him. So he was definitely, kind of tuned in with the land just because that's where that's all there was. But he was really into like engineering, and so he'd do these little projects, and the story goes is that he had designed this little contraption and he entered it into a science fair, and somebody from the University of Wisconsin was there and saw his little invention and was so impressed that they basically strong-armed him into going to the University of Wisconsin. And so that's what he did. And so John Muir and I have that in common because I also went there and could feel the John Muir vibes. And actually when I was there, I saw one of his inventions, and so I've got a picture of it here. It's super cool. So this is one of John Muir's things that he designed. And so apparently his father was super strict, and they're super religious too. So for the longest time, all he was allowed to have was a Bible. And so hard living on the farm. But eventually he started to study, and he built this thing, and it was so he could maximize his study time. And so basically what this thing is, it's all entirely out of wood, and these are wooden gears. And he set up his books here, and up here somehow it's like a sundial, and this thing would react to the sun. And when the sun was in a certain position in the sky, the whole contraption would shift his next book. So he'd go from, I don't know, biology to math to whatever, all based on this contraption. Kind of crazy. I've seen it with my own 2 eyes. So anyway, the story continues. So he got done with Wisconsin, degree in engineering, and he went to work at a manufacturing plant. And he rose up the ranks. He was the crew boss or the foreman until one day there was an accident on the floor in the factory, and there was a small explosion. And John Muir was involved, and he was hospitalized for like a month. And his head was bandaged, and there was a really good chance he'd never be able to see again. And so it's one of those classic stories. While he was bandaged, and he was just sitting in the dark for an entire month, but while he was in the dark, he saw the light, and he questioned his existence and those kinds of things. And when they finally took the bandages off and he could actually see again, he basically quit his job at the plant and had like a Forrest Gump moment, and he started to walk. And he walked and he walked, and he tried to walk all the way to Mexico from Wisconsin, which is too far to walk. He found out, and he had got sick and malaria, all this stuff on the way, but he just kept on going, and eventually he ended up in Yosemite. And I've got a picture of Yosemite here. If you haven't been to Yosemite, you got to go. It's like there's no place in the world quite like it, and it's just 4 hours away. But so he lived here before it was a national park, and the folklore goes that he was so into nature at this point. It'd be like a lightning storm, and he'd go out and he'd climb the tallest tree he could find just to be a little closer to nature. And so he was there for a while, and then one of his big things that he did was he saw Yosemite, and he knew people were, coming through and logging and things like that, and he's like, not this place. And so he convinced Theodore Roosevelt, who incidentally was working with Gifford Pinchot at the same time. So this is all happening in the same little time period. He got Roosevelt to come out, and they rode on horseback. And apparently Roosevelt was a big hunter too, so he was an outdoors kind of guy. And so I believe this is at the top of, that's Yosemite Falls in the background there, so this must be on the other side. But anyway, so he convinced Roosevelt to set this area aside to be preserved, not conserved, preserved. That means we're not going to touch it. And so what Muir believed was that these resources have intrinsic value. It's not just a monetary value. They have just existing is enough, and that some of these resources need to be preserved and some entire areas need to stay wild. Some people call national parks the single best idea the United States has ever had, making national parks. In other countries, they don't have them, right? So anyway, so Muir did that, and he got Roosevelt on board, and they also did the Grand Canyon and other parks as well. And so again, the difference between Muir and Pinchot is Muir didn't want to use the resources. We're going to set them aside. We're going to just put them over there. But interestingly, if you go to Yosemite or any national park, the only thing you can do there is recreation, biking and hiking and that kind of stuff, camping. But if you go to Yosemite, they have so many people coming through that there's a huge impact. There's traces of smog. They've got big traffic problems, including traffic jams and garbage, and so that the recreation leaves an impact too. So I've been to national forests where it's like, there's logging and things going on, but there's just way less people, and so maybe there's a lower impact, even though they're using different resources. And so it's an interesting just kind of way to look at things. And so the last slide I'm going to leave you with here is this one here. If you haven't been to Muir Woods, it's about a half hour from San Francisco on the Marin side, and so this was just like another salute to John Muir. And there's a John Muir Trail in the Sierras, but you got to go here. Look at how big these redwoods are, just so close to San Francisco. It's like it is a spiritual world in there. And this is the place they film. If you've seen Return of the Jedi, this is the last scene where they do the Ewoks with those furry creatures chasing each other around the forest. It was filmed here in Muir Woods. Skywalker Ranch is not too far from there with George Lucas and all that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and sign off. I hope you found that interesting. What I would highly encourage you to do is go back, and it says summary there. I don't know if it's gotten cut off, but summarize the entire thing of the Cornell notes there, and then go through and put little questions here in the margin. Hope you found that interesting. We'll see you next time. Thanks.